You know Muruganar? Scholarly poet, devotee of Bhagavan. Bhagavan encouraged him, Bhagavan encouraged him to write a long devotional Tamil work that would be patterned on Tiruvachikam, which was a famous collection of songs praising Siva written about 1,000 years ago by Manikavachika.
Do you translate it?
No. Manikavachika had written this classic text of devotional poetry about 1,000 years ago. Muruganar had come to Bhagavan and demonstrated he was a great poet, and Bhagavan could also tell that Muruganar wanted to have the same relationship with Bhagavan that Manikavachika had had with Shiva, and that included writing this devotional poetry praising his guru. So Bhagavan said, why don't you write a book or a work similar to Manikavachika's Tiruvachikam? Muruganar, of course, how can I do this? This man was one of the greatest saints, one of the greatest poets of Tamil history. How can I possibly do this? But Bhagavan kept pressing, and so finally Muruganar agreed. So he wrote this book, and it's called Sri Ramanasramam Marai, and the pattern follows the original Tiruvachikam in the way it's structured. The first edition came out in 1933, but there were some gaps in the work. The original Tiruvachikam starts off with a very ecstatic poem called Siva Puranam, in which Manikavachika is praising Siva. This is probably one of the most famous and most often chanted poems in the whole of Tamil literature. It's a real classic, and it just makes people cry when they hear it in Tamil. It's such a beautiful poem in praise of Shiva. And I think Muruganar just felt he couldn't really do justice to a poem like this first time round, so he left it. And then for the second edition he started writing the equivalent first poem, which was a little bit based on Siva Puranam, and he wasn't sure what to call it. He thought possibly Siva Puranam as well, and then he thought, but I'm praising Bhagavan, why don't I call it Ramana Puranam? And he got a bit stuck. He wrote 200 lines. It was a single verse poem, and he completed 200 lines, got stuck, was wondering about what he should call it. So he went out for a walk, just left his work there. Came back that evening and discovered that Bhagavan had picked up his manuscript, and number one, he'd solved the problem of what to call it, because he'd written Ramana Puranam as a title at the top of every single sheet of paper. But more than that, he'd completed the poem, and he had written more than Muruganar had written himself. So Muruganar had written 200 lines, and when he came back in the evening, Bhagavan had written more than 300 and completed the poem, which is now about 540 lines long. Muruganar sent this off to the printers to be set up in type, and he added a footnote at the bottom of the first page that said, I'm responsible for the first 200 lines. Bhagavan himself wrote the remaining 300 lines. Bhagavan saw this, looked at Muruganar and said, am I alone responsible for the last 300 lines? Meaning, I inspired you, I made you write the first 200 as well. So Muruganar realised his mistake, and he crossed out this footnote on page 1. And from that moment on, he would never ever tell anybody where the dividing line was between where he stopped and went for his walk and where the rest of the poem is. We know approximately it's 200, 300 split. But even his best friends, the devotees, would say, come on, tell us, where's your last line, and where did Bhagavan start his? And he would just say, it's all Bhagavan, there's no join, it's all Bhagavan. So we don't really know exactly where Bhagavan's contribution starts, except we know 60%, the last 60% approximately, was written by Bhagavan. This is undoubtedly the last thing that Bhagavan ever composed which has never appeared in English. It's 300 lines. 300 lines is actually longer than Aladu Narpadu or any of the other works. And somehow it never got translated into English, which is unfortunate. So the three of us who did Padamalai, that's Robert Butler, Venkata Subramaniam and myself, we sat down and worked our way through this. One reason it hasn't been published is that it's a very dense, poetic, literary style, which is almost impossible for anyone even to understand, much less translate, unless he or she has had a long training in Tamil literature and how it's constructed. Just to tell you one of the problems, this poem is 540 lines long, and it's one sentence. You don't punctuate in Tamil poetry, so you start on line 1 and you don't finish the sentence until 20 pages later, when you get to line 540. Plus it's got endless subclauses, digressions. He tells whole mythological stories. You can do this in Tamil poetry. You can have... you tell cavalry not to make some noise for a while. You can have digressions, long descriptions, endless subclauses. Come back to your main subject and carry on. You can't do this in English or any other language, I know. But it meant that this poem was very dense, very literary, and also very, very different from anything Bhagavan ever wrote himself. You have to understand that Bhagavan was imitating Muruganar, so he wrote in Muruganar's style as if he was Muruganar, and Muruganar himself was imitating Manikavachika, who was a poet who died 1,000 years ago. So what we have is Bhagavan writing as if he was Muruganar, imitating a poet who died 1,000 years ago. So it's a completely different kind of style. It's very flowery, very devotional, full of endless praises to Shiva, Ramana. And I think that's probably one reason why it hasn't been translated. It's just such an odd work. It got ignored for a long time. But the original Siva Puranam is not a philosophical work. It's simply Manikavachika praising ecstatically, rapturously his God, his Guru. No didacticism, no teachings, nothing. It's just Siva, you're great, Siva, I love you, all the way through. Bhagavan followed this pattern a little bit, but then somehow he took the liberty of digressing into his own teachings, his own philosophy, so that after a while, after he's composed a few lines, you suddenly think, I know this, I've read this before, and he's starting to rewrite, recompose major sections from Aladu Narpadu. So he's giving longer, more expanded versions of his own written teachings. And this, for me, is why the work is so important. This is Bhagavan himself writing longer, more detailed versions of teachings that already existed in his collected works. For me, this was enough of an incentive to translate the work. It's completely new written material by Bhagavan that has never appeared in English, and in many cases he's explaining or elaborating on written material that already exists. You want me to read a bit? You turn your camera off, I'll find you. Just a quick sample. This is 3 of the lines. The second and the third person manifesting as multiplicity appear after the first person. The foremost of the foremost arises. When it disappears by knowing its source, along with it the other 2 simultaneously vanish in that place. The light of that source which then shines is the indivisible fullness that is one's own true form. Now that's an expansion of verse 14 of Aladu Narpadu. And then further down the page, to investigate the past and the future without considering yourself You who abide perpetually in the present moment as the peerless now, is this not like counting without the number one? And that's almost identical to verse 15 of Oladu Nakadu. So periodically he gives up. It's a bit odd that he's taken this work on himself of praising himself. I mean, Muruganar is writing this long poem praising Bhagavan, and then Bhagavan has to finish it himself. So he's sitting down saying, Ramana, you're great, Ramana, you're great, Ramana, you're great, which is a little bit strange. But then periodically, do you want to wait for the dog? Shall we?
Yes.
Saying, why are you singing? Why are you singing Ramana Satguru? And he said, is this Ramana, this 6 feet body you see in front of me? Ramana is the self. Why am I not allowed to praise the self as well? So, in the same way, when Muruganar is praising Ramana, Ramana is not seeing himself as a form that's being praised. He knows that Muruganar is praising the formless self. So he has no problem praising Ramana. But then, periodically, he can't stick to the theme. So he stops a little bit and starts writing teachings which are very good.